Margaret Hale had never imagined that the woman who built a company from a card table in her mother's garage would one day watch her own husband's private jet land 3 days late, carrying a story that would end everything she thought she understood about her life. The moment she saw the hotel receipt on his phone, 2 names, 1 room, 3 nights, she did not scream, she did not cry, she simply picked up her own phone and called her lawyer, and by sunrise the company's accounts, the ones she alone had the authority to freeze as co-founder and majority shareholder, were locked tight. That is where this story begins, in the quiet, cold minutes after a woman's heart shattered and her mind, somehow, stayed perfectly clear. Before we go further into Margaret's story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life from broken pieces, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, shared it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribed to our channel. Stories like Margaret's remind us that our community is made of people who have been hurt and have still chosen to believe in better days, and your support means more to us than you know. Margaret Hale was 36 years old when her world cracked open on an ordinary Tuesday morning, but to understand how she got there, you have to go back 9 years, to a sunlit afternoon when she was a 27-year-old accountant with calloused hands from working 2 jobs and a notebook full of numbers that nobody believed in yet. She had met Nathaniel Cross at a small business expo in Denver, where he was pitching an idea for a logistics software company to a room of half-interested investors who kept checking their watches. Margaret was the only one who stayed after his presentation to ask him real questions about his cash flow projections, and Nathaniel, charming and a little too confident for his own good, had laughed and said that she was the first person in the room who understood what he was actually trying to build. Within 6 months they were business partners. Within a year, they were married in a small church with folding chairs and a potluck reception, because neither of them had money for anything grander, and neither of them cared. For the first 5 years of Cross Logistics Solutions, Margaret was the backbone nobody saw. While Nathaniel charmed clients and gave interviews about disruptive innovation, Margaret was the one negotiating with vendors at midnight, the one who mortgaged their small house to make payroll during a rough quarter, the one who cried alone in the office bathroom when a deal fell through and then walked out 5 minutes later with dry eyes because someone had to keep the team steady. She never asked for credit. She believed, with the kind of quiet faith some people reserve for prayer, that if she just kept working, kept believing in Nathaniel and in what they were building together, everything would even out eventually. And in some ways, it did. By the time Margaret turned 34, Cross Logistics Solutions had grown from a 2-person operation into a company worth over $400 million, with offices in 6 cities and Nathaniel's face on the cover of 2 business magazines. What the magazines never mentioned was that Margaret held 42% of the company's shares, more than any other single stakeholder, including Nathaniel himself, a fact that had seemed like a formality back when they trusted each other completely, back when a 50-50 split had felt too transactional for 2 people who had built something out of love and stubbornness rather than legal caution. The cracks, when Margaret looked back on them later, had been there for almost 2 years before that Tuesday morning, small and easy to explain away the way people explain away almost anything when they desperately do not want to see the truth. Nathaniel had started traveling more, first for conferences, then for what he called strategic partnerships, trips that kept extending by a day here, 2 days there. He had grown distant at home, quicker to snap at their 11-year-old daughter, Charlotte, quicker to sigh when Margaret asked about his day, quicker to fall asleep on the couch instead of coming to bed. Margaret told herself it was the pressure of running a company that had grown faster than either of them had ever planned for. She told herself that success sometimes cost a marriage its softness, and that if she just gave him space, if she just kept holding the family together the way she had always held everything together, he would find his way back to her. She did not know, could not have known, that during one of those extended trips to a logistics conference in San Diego, Nathaniel had met Vivian Ashworth, a striking regional sales director for a competing firm, a woman 9 years younger than Margaret with an easy laugh and none of the exhaustion that comes from building something from nothing. What began as professional conversations over conference dinners slowly became something else entirely, something Nathaniel told himself was harmless until it very clearly was not. The Tuesday morning that changed everything began like any other. Margaret had made Charlotte's lunch, dropped her off at school, and driven to the office with a coffee going cold in the cup holder because she was too busy reviewing the quarterly numbers in her head to remember to drink it. Nathaniel had told her 3 days earlier that he was flying to Chicago for an emergency meeting with a potential investor, the kind of trip that happened often enough that Margaret barely registered it as unusual. He had texted a few times during those 3 days, brief messages about the meetings running long, about the investor wanting another day to finalize terms, messages that felt normal enough that Margaret had no reason to question them. It was only when Nathaniel's phone, left behind on the kitchen counter that morning in his rush to catch an early flight back, buzzed with a notification that Margaret happened to glance at while wiping down the counter that the first crack finally split wide open. The notification was from a hotel loyalty app, thanking Nathaniel for his stay and hoping he had enjoyed his 3 nights at a resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, a city that had nothing to do with Chicago or any investor meeting Margaret had ever heard of. Margaret stood frozen in her kitchen for a long moment, the dish towel still in her hand, staring at the notification as though it might rearrange itself into something less devastating if she looked at it long enough. Then, with the kind of steady, terrible calm that only comes from years of training herself not to panic during business crises, she opened the app itself. It took her 4 minutes to find the reservation confirmation, still saved in the app's history, with 2 names listed as guests, Nathaniel Cross and Vivian Ashworth. 4 minutes to learn that her husband, the man she had built an empire beside, the father of her daughter, had spent 3 days and 3 nights in a hotel suite with another woman while sending Margaret texts about investor meetings that had never existed. What Margaret felt in that moment was not the explosive, screaming grief that movies like to show. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating, a kind of cold clarity that settled into her bones like ice water. She thought of every late night she had spent holding the company together while believing she was also holding her marriage together. She thought of every time she had made excuses for his distance, every time she had told herself she was the problem for feeling neglected, every time she had chosen to trust him because trusting him had always felt safer than facing the alternative. And in that moment of terrible clarity, Margaret Hale made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life. She would not scream, she would not beg, she would not wait for an apology that might never come sincerely. She would protect herself, and she would protect Charlotte, with the same discipline and precision she had used to protect the company for 9 years. She called her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rosalind Pierce whom Margaret had worked with on the company's original incorporation papers, and asked her a single question. Given her 42% controlling interest in her position as chief financial officer, could she legally freeze the company's operating accounts pending an internal investigation into what she vaguely but truthfully described as a serious breach of trust by the CEO? Rosalind, who had known Margaret long enough to hear the steel in her voice and not ask too many questions in that first call, confirmed that yes, given the specific structure of their shareholder agreement, Margaret absolutely could, and within 2 hours, she had. Every account that required dual authorization, every major transaction, every wire transfer above $10,000, was locked. Nathaniel, still in the air flying home from Scottsdale with no idea what awaited him, would land to find that the company he had spent 9 years believing he controlled had, in the span of a single morning, been quietly and completely taken out of his hands by the woman who had built it beside him. When Nathaniel finally arrived home that evening, tired and suntanned in a way that made Margaret's stomach turn, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of documents in front of her and an expression on her face that he had never seen before, not in 9 years of marriage, not even during the worst of their early financial struggles. She did not yell. She simply slid the hotel confirmation across the table and asked him, in a voice so even it frightened him more than shouting would have, to explain Scottsdale. Nathaniel's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock that she knew, panic as he tried to construct a lie, and finally a kind of defeated collapse when he realized there was no lie sophisticated enough to explain away a hotel reservation with Vivian Ashworth's name printed directly beside his own. He did not deny it. He sat down heavily across from her and, in halting, broken sentences, admitted that the affair had been going on for nearly 8 months, that Scottsdale had not been the first trip, only the first one Margaret had discovered, and that he did not know how to explain why he had done it except to say that somewhere in the exhaustion of building an empire, he had started to feel invisible in his own marriage, and Vivian had made him feel seen in a way he was ashamed to admit he had craved. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her face unreadable. When he finally finished, when the silence stretched long enough that Nathaniel began to hope, foolishly, that her calm meant she might forgive him quickly, Margaret told him what she had already done. She told him about the frozen accounts, about the fact that as of that morning, he could not authorize a single major transaction without her signature, and that she intended to keep it that way until she had time to think clearly about what she wanted her life, her daughter's life, and the company they had built together to look like going forward. Nathaniel's shock at learning about the frozen accounts was almost as profound as Margaret's shock had been that morning at the kitchen counter, because in 9 years of marriage, he had never once seen Margaret use her power against him, had perhaps even forgotten, in his growing arrogance as the public face of their success, that she held more power than he did at all. The days that followed were some of the most painful of Margaret's life, though not in the way she might have expected. She had braced herself for grief, for the kind of aching sadness that comes from losing a marriage, and that grief did come, in waves that hit her at unexpected moments, in the middle of a board meeting, in the car line at Charlotte's school, in the quiet hour after her daughter fell asleep. But what she had not braced herself for was the exhausting, grinding work of untangling a life and a company that had been built so completely around two people functioning as one unit that separating them felt almost surgical. The board of directors, most of whom had worked with both Margaret and Nathaniel for years, were stunned when word began to leak that the CEO's accounts had been frozen by his own wife and business partner. Some of them, particularly the older members who had known Margaret since the early scrappy days of the company, rallied immediately to her side, quietly furious on her behalf and grateful, in a way they did not fully articulate, that someone with real power had finally acted decisively when a leader's personal failures threatened to become the company's failure too. Others, newer to the board and more loyal to the charismatic image Nathaniel had cultivated in the press, worried aloud about how the story would look if it became public, worried about investor confidence, worried about the kind of scandal that could tank a stock price even for a privately held company preparing for its next funding round. It was during one particularly tense board meeting, held just 5 days after Margaret's discovery, that the full weight of what she had done and what she still had to decide crystallized for her. Sitting at the head of the conference table where Nathaniel usually sat, because the board had unanimously agreed that Margaret should chair the meeting given the circumstances, she looked around at the faces of people who had trusted her and Nathaniel with their careers, their investments, their belief in what the two of them could build, and she understood that this was no longer simply a private matter of a marriage in crisis. It was a matter of stewardship, of what kind of leader she wanted to be when the people around her needed steadiness most. She proposed, and the board approved, a temporary restructuring in which Margaret would serve as interim CEO while an independent investigation, conducted by outside counsel, reviewed whether Nathaniel's conduct had involved any misuse of company resources during his trips with Vivian Ashworth, given that some of the travel had been billed, at least partially, to corporate accounts under the guise of business development. It was a humiliating process for Nathaniel, watching auditors comb through expense reports that documented, in cold financial detail, exactly how much of the affair he had unknowingly or perhaps knowingly funded with company money, a discovery that added a layer of professional betrayal to what had already been a devastating personal one. Charlotte, 11 years old and sharp enough to notice that something was deeply wrong in her household even when her parents tried their best to shield her, became Margaret's greatest source of both pain and motivation during those weeks. Margaret remembered one afternoon in particular, about 2 weeks after the discovery, when Charlotte had come home from school and asked, with the blunt honesty only a child can manage, why her father was sleeping in the guest room and why her mother's eyes looked puffy every morning even though she smiled and said everything was fine. Margaret had sat her daughter down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had confronted Nathaniel weeks earlier, and made a decision that she would not lie to her daughter, but that she would also not burden an 11-year-old with the full weight of adult betrayal. She told Charlotte that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt the people who love them, that her father had made a mistake that had badly hurt Margaret's feelings, and that they were figuring out, together, what their family was going to look like moving forward, but that no matter what happened between her and her father, both of them loved Charlotte completely and always would. Charlotte had cried, and Margaret had held her, and in that moment, rocking her daughter in the same kitchen where her marriage had both been confronted and where, years earlier, she had once danced with baby Charlotte in her arms while Nathaniel played guitar badly and laughed at his own mistakes, Margaret understood with total clarity that whatever she decided to do about her marriage, her decisions about the company, about her own dignity, about the example she wanted to set for her daughter, all had to be rooted in something stronger than anger. They had to be rooted in self-respect. Nathaniel, for his part, did not disappear into denial or defensiveness the way Margaret had half expected him to, given how she had watched his ego swell over the years of success. Instead, something in him seemed to break open in a way that, while it did not excuse what he had done, did begin to reveal a man Margaret had not seen in years, not since the early days when he was simply a determined young entrepreneur with more passion than polish. He moved out of the guest room and into a small apartment near the office, not because Margaret demanded it, though she certainly would have, but because he told her, in one of the few honest conversations they had during those brutal early weeks, that he did not think he deserved to sleep under the same roof as the family he had betrayed while he figured out who he actually wanted to be. He ended things with Vivian Ashworth immediately and completely, a fact Margaret confirmed not because she trusted his word alone but because Vivian herself, in an unexpected turn, sent Margaret a brief, contrite email a few weeks later, explaining that she had not known Nathaniel was married when their professional relationship first began, that she had found out only after feelings had already developed, and that she deeply regretted the pain her involvement had caused, however inadequate that regret might feel. Margaret did not respond to the email, not out of coldness but because she genuinely did not know what there was to say, and because she recognized that her energy needed to go toward rebuilding her own life rather than managing anyone else's guilt. The independent investigation into the company's finances took nearly 6 weeks to complete, and during that time, Margaret ran cross-logistic solutions with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She discovered, in those weeks of stepping fully into a leadership role she had always occupied in practice but never in title, a version of herself that had been quietly waiting beneath 9 years of standing slightly behind Nathaniel's spotlight. She was good at this. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled at the kind of decisive, values-driven leadership that made people trust her, that made the team work harder not out of fear but out of respect. Employees who had barely known her name beyond Nathaniel's wife who handles the numbers began stopping by her office to thank her for the clarity she brought to decisions, for the way she made time to listen to concerns that had gone unheard for months under Nathaniel's increasingly distracted leadership. It was not lost on Margaret, during this period, how much of her own light she had dimmed over the years, not because Nathaniel had explicitly asked her to, but because she had allowed herself to believe that her role was to support his story rather than to build her own. The investigation ultimately concluded that while Nathaniel had used a modest amount of company funds to cover portions of his travel with Vivian Ashworth under falsified business justifications, the amount was not large enough to constitute the kind of criminal fraud that would require legal action, though it was more than enough to constitute a serious breach of his fiduciary duty as CEO. The board, presented with the investigation's findings and with Margaret's controlling shareholder position giving her ultimate authority over the outcome, faced a decision about Nathaniel's future with the company he had co-founded. It would have been easy, and many people around Margaret, including Rosalind her lawyer and several sympathetic board members, expected her to push for Nathaniel's complete removal, to take the win, to claim the company entirely as her own and let him face the professional consequences of his personal failures. Margaret spent 3 days sitting with that option, turning it over in her mind during long walks she took alone in the early mornings before Charlotte woke up, walks that had become her only reliable space for clear thinking during a season when almost nothing felt clear. What Margaret ultimately decided surprised almost everyone, including, in some ways, herself. She did not choose complete removal, and she also did not choose to simply return things to how they had been before, pretending the frozen accounts and the investigation and the betrayal had never happened. Instead, she proposed a restructuring that reflected the truth of what she now understood about their partnership, that she was not, and had never been, merely the support system behind Nathaniel's vision, but an equal architect of everything they had built, and that any path forward for the company, and for their marriage if there was to be one at all, needed to reflect that truth honestly. Nathaniel would remain with the company, but not as sole CEO. Margaret proposed a co-CEO structure, formalizing publicly what had always been true privately, with Nathaniel handling external partnerships and business development, areas where his natural charisma genuinely added value, while Margaret took over full authority on financial strategy, operations, and internal culture, areas she had quietly mastered over 9 years without ever claiming the title that matched her contribution. The board, impressed by the maturity and strategic wisdom of the proposal, approved it unanimously, several members privately telling Margaret afterward that they believed the company would be stronger under genuine shared leadership than it had ever been under Nathaniel's singular, increasingly distracted command. The question of the marriage itself proved far more complicated than the question of the company, because unlike corporate restructuring, there was no board to vote on whether Margaret's heart should trust Nathaniel again. In the weeks after the investigation concluded, Nathaniel began the slow, humbling work of trying to earn back something he knew he had no right to demand. He started seeing a therapist, something Margaret had gently suggested years earlier during a rough patch and that he had always dismissed as unnecessary for someone as busy and successful as he considered himself to be. In therapy, guided by a counselor who specialized in infidelity recovery, Nathaniel began to unpack the insecurities that had made him vulnerable to an affair in the first place, the way his own father had modeled a version of success that equated worth entirely with external validation, the way he had learned early in life to seek attention and admiration rather than genuine intimacy, and the way the pressures of running a rapidly growing company had made him feel, paradoxically, both more powerful and more emotionally empty than he had ever felt in the scrappy early days when he and Margaret had nothing but each other and a shared dream. Margaret, for her part, did not rush toward forgiveness, and she was honest with Nathaniel about that from the beginning. She told him, during one of their first real conversations after the initial shock had settled into something more like grim acceptance, that she was not interested in performing forgiveness for the sake of keeping their family looking intact, and that she would not pretend to feel healed simply because enough time had passed that people around them expected resolution. She told him that trust, once broken as completely as he had broken it, was not something that could be rebuilt through grand gestures or apologies alone, but only through a long, unglamorous accumulation of consistent honesty over time, and that she genuinely did not know, in those early weeks, whether that accumulation would ever add up to enough for her to feel safe with him again. What she asked of him was not promises but patience, patience with her anger when it resurfaced unexpectedly, patience with her questions when she needed to understand details about the affair that most people would have told her to simply let go of, patience with the reality that she might, after everything, ultimately decide that the healthiest path forward was separation rather than reconciliation. Nathaniel, to his credit, did not flinch from any of it. He answered every question she asked, even the painful ones, without minimizing his responsibility or shifting blame onto the pressures of his job or the distance that had grown in their marriage before the affair began, understanding, with a clarity therapy had helped him reach, that explaining the conditions that made an affair possible was different from excusing the choice itself. He showed up, consistently, for Charlotte, making sure that whatever happened between him and Margaret, his daughter never once felt like an afterthought in the crisis her parents were navigating. He coached her soccer team's practices on weekends, something he had always meant to do more of but had let slide during his years of being consumed by the company. He picked her up from school on the days it was his turn, arriving early and waiting in the car line with the other parents rather than rushing in at the last minute the way he used to. Slowly, through hundreds of small, unremarkable actions that added up over months rather than weeks, Margaret began to notice something shifting, not a dramatic transformation but a quiet, steady rebuilding of the kind of man she had once believed him to be. It would be dishonest to say the months that followed were easy, because they were not. There were nights when Margaret lay awake replaying the image of that hotel confirmation in her mind, feeling the same cold shock all over again as though no time had passed at all. There were moments at work when she caught Nathaniel laughing easily with a colleague and felt a flash of irrational anger, wondering whether that same easy charm was what had drawn Vivian Ashworth to him in the first place. There were awkward family gatherings, holidays that had once been simple and joyful now waited with unspoken tension as extended family members who had heard whispers of the scandal watched Margaret and Nathaniel carefully, trying to gauge whether the marriage was salvageable or simply performing normalcy for Charlotte's sake. Margaret's own mother, a practical woman who had never fully trusted Nathaniel's easy charisma even in the early years, told Margaret bluntly during one difficult phone call that she would support whatever decision Margaret made, but that she personally believed some betrayals could never be fully undone, and that Margaret should not feel obligated to stay in a marriage simply because reconciliation made for a tidier story. That conversation with her mother, though it stung in the moment, ended up clarifying something important for Margaret. She realized that she had been quietly worried, beneath all her careful, deliberate processing, that choosing to work toward reconciliation might look to the outside world like weakness, like she was the kind of woman who let herself be walked over and then welcomed her husband back with open arms simply because he had money and status and a daughter who loved him. She had frozen his company. She had taken control. She had proven, unmistakably, to herself and to everyone watching, that she was not a woman who could be dismissed or underestimated. And it was precisely because she had already proven that strength to herself in the most concrete way possible that she began to realize she did not need to prove it further by refusing forgiveness out of pride. If she chose, eventually, to rebuild her marriage, it would not be because she was weak or desperate to keep her family together at any cost. It would be because she had genuinely watched a man do the excruciating work of change, and because some part of her, the part that remembered dancing in a small church with folding chairs, the part that remembered mortgaging their house together and celebrating their first profitable quarter with a bottle of cheap champagne in their tiny apartment, still believed that people could grow beyond their worst moments if they were willing to do the work honestly. Around the 8-month mark after her discovery, Margaret and Nathaniel began, cautiously, to explore what it might look like to be a couple again rather than simply co-parents and co-COs navigating a painful arrangement. It started small, a dinner together after a particularly successful board meeting, just the two of them at a quiet restaurant they used to frequent in the early days of the company when a nice dinner out felt like a rare luxury. Nathaniel did not push for anything during that dinner, did not assume that a shared meal meant forgiveness had arrived, and that restraint, that willingness to let Margaret set the pace entirely without pressure, told her something meaningful about how much he had actually internalized from the months of therapy and reflection. Over the following weeks, more small moments accumulated: a walk through the park near Charlotte's school while she was at soccer practice, a quiet Sunday morning where Nathaniel made pancakes the way he used to in their first apartment, burning the edges slightly the same way he always had, a detail so small and so unchanged that it made Margaret laugh out loud for the first time in months, a laugh that surprised her with how genuine it felt. It was during one of these slowly accumulating moments of tentative rebuilding, a warm Saturday afternoon nearly a year after the discovery, that Margaret found herself sitting on their back porch watching Charlotte practice cartwheels in the yard while Nathaniel grilled dinner nearby, and she realized, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that she felt something close to peace. Not the naive, unquestioning happiness of their early marriage. That particular kind of trust could never fully return in its original form, and Margaret had made peace with that loss the way one makes peace with any genuine loss, by grieving it honestly rather than pretending it had not happened. But what she felt instead was something perhaps more valuable, a hard-won, clear-eyed peace built on the knowledge that she had faced the worst betrayal of her life and had responded not with helplessness but with agency, that she had protected herself, her daughter, and the company they had built without losing her integrity in the process, and that whatever came next, whether she and Nathaniel found their way to a renewed marriage or eventually decided that friendship and shared parenting were the healthiest final destination for their relationship, she would face it as a woman who knew, beyond any doubt, exactly what she was capable of. The company itself, under the co-CEO structure Margaret had insisted upon, flourished in ways that surprised even the most optimistic board members. With Margaret's steady financial discipline balanced against Nathaniel's genuine talent for building partnerships, now tempered by a humility his younger self had sorely lacked, cross-logistics solutions expanded into 2 new international markets within 18 months, and the culture within the company shifted noticeably, employees later remarking that the workplace felt more honest, more collaborative, less driven by any single ego and more genuinely oriented around shared purpose. Margaret became something of a quiet inspiration to other women in the industry, not because she ever sought that spotlight. She remained, by nature, someone who preferred substance to publicity, but because her story, pieces of which inevitably became known within industry circles despite her efforts at privacy, resonated deeply with other women who had spent years building success quietly behind more visible partners, who recognized in Margaret's journey a permission they had not previously given themselves to claim their own power and worth. If this story has touched something in you, if you have ever felt invisible in a role you poured your whole heart into, if you have ever had to find the strength to protect yourself and the people you love when someone you trusted let you down, we would love to hear from you. Before we finish this story, please leave a comment below sharing what forgiveness, or strength, or second chances means to you, because these stories become so much more meaningful when our community shares in them together. 2 years after that terrible Tuesday morning in her kitchen, Margaret Hale stood at the front of a conference room, not as the woman quietly supporting someone else's vision, but as the co-CEO whose name now appeared alongside Nathaniel's on every official document, delivering a keynote about resilient leadership to a room of young entrepreneurs who had no idea about the private earthquake that had reshaped her life just 24 months earlier. Charlotte, now 13 and remarkably wise for her age, sat in the front row that day, having begged to skip school to watch her mother speak, and when Margaret finished her talk, describing without naming specifics the importance of knowing your own worth even when the people around you have not fully seen it, Charlotte was the first one on her feet applauding, her face lit with a pride that told Margaret everything she needed to know about whether her daughter had absorbed the right lessons from watching her parents navigate the hardest season of their lives. Nathaniel and Margaret did, ultimately, choose each other again, though their marriage today looks different from the one they had before, built now on a foundation of hard-earned honesty rather than assumed trust, a marriage where difficult conversations happen regularly rather than being avoided in favor of comfortable silence, where Nathaniel has learned to check in genuinely rather than simply assume everything is fine, and where Margaret has learned that claiming her own power does not threaten love but actually makes it more honest. They do not present themselves as a perfect success story, and Margaret is careful, whenever her story comes up in conversation with friends navigating their own struggles, to emphasize that reconciliation is not the right or even possible path for every couple who faces betrayal, and that choosing to leave can be just as much an act of strength and self-respect as choosing to stay. What mattered most, she often says, was never really about whether she took Nathaniel back, but about the fact that she never once, throughout the entire ordeal, lost sight of her own worth, her own capability, and her own right to demand honesty and respect regardless of what she ultimately decided to do with the marriage itself. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Our channel exists because our community believes, together, in the possibility of healing after heartbreak, in the quiet power that lives inside people who refuse to be diminished by betrayal, and in the second chances that only become meaningful when they are built on truth rather than convenience. Margaret Hale's story reminds us that strength does not always look like anger, that sometimes it looks like cold, clear decisiveness in the face of devastation, and that forgiveness, when it comes, means so much more when it is chosen freely by someone who has already proven, beyond any doubt, exactly what she is capable of standing without. Thank you for spending this time with us, for letting Margaret's journey remind you of your own worth, and for being part of our family here, where every story of heartbreak is also, in the end, a story of hope.